Okay, I wanted to welcome everyone to our Pantheon webinar today. Now, this webinar is called Content as a Service, What to Know About Decoupled CMS, a Pantheon webinar with Four Kitchens and Pixo. So welcome everyone. We have a really great agenda today and some wonderful speakers. A few announcements before we officially get started. Everyone will be on mute, but we have set aside some time for Q&A. As you have questions, feel free to write your questions in the question chat window, and we'll make sure we get to them during the Q&A portion. Also, a recording of this webinar is being made and will be available on our website after the webinar, and will also be emailed out to the attendees. And if you'd like to follow us on Twitter, our Twitter handle is @GetPantheon. Feel free to tweet about the webinar as we go. So to start off, I'd like to introduce our speakers. First off, Josh Koenig is co-founder and head of developer experience at Pantheon. Josh is an avid advocate for developers. As a very early Drupal adopter, Josh was part of the team that drove the first high-profile public Drupal use case with the Howard Dean campaign in 2003. He went on to found the Drupal Dojo, an online learning community for developers, and to co-found Chapter 3, a Drupal agency in San Francisco. Next, we have Mike Manecki, Director of Technology at Four Kitchens. Mike has been building websites since 1999. As Director of Technology, he leads and coaches Four Kitchens' technical team. Mike is an avid speaker and has presented at more than a dozen conferences across the country. Before becoming a web chef and moving to Austin, Mike worked for some of LA's top interactive agencies. And last, we have Brandon Bowersox-Johnson, Chief Technology Officer at Pixo. Brandon has wide-ranging experience as a software engineer, database designer, and technical lead on hundreds of projects at Pixo since 1998. Brandon is the Chief Technology Strategist for Pixo. He guides teams in selecting and designing effective software solutions. He has spearheaded Pixo's efforts to implement cost-effective usability engineering, web standards and accessibility, and rigorous quality assurance. So we're really excited to have all of our great speakers today. Quickly, I just wanted to go over the agenda. We're going to start off with Josh giving us an overview and talking about why decoupled CMS. Then we'll go into two case studies. The first will be from Mike Manecki at Four Kitchens, and the second case study from Brandon Bowersox-Johnson at Pixo. And last, we'll leave plenty of time for discussion and Q&A at the end of the presentations. And with that, I'll turn it over to Josh.
Thanks, Linda. So this is a hot topic right now, for good reason. It's a use case that has been emerging over the past several years. I did a pretty well-attended presentation on the subject at DrupalCon Los Angeles just about a month ago. And there's a ton of interest around this right now, and it's a good time to be doing this webinar, and I'm really excited to have sort of on-the-ground case studies from Mike and Brandon. But I'm just going to set the stage a little bit to talk about why everyone is excited and what the interest is in decoupling our CMSs, a conscious uncoupling, if you will. The current state of the art, the standard is that we have a monolithic architecture. There's a single instance, there's a single piece of software, it drives the website. And that's the world that most of us came up in. That's the world that most of us currently inhabit. And within these architectures, monolithic architecture has been around in the software industry forever. There's nothing really wrong with it. It's and it's a tried and true mechanism. Oh, we got a little echo.
Oops. Okay, sorry about that.
So and within our monoliths, we have a little bit of we have separation in layers. There's a theme layer that's different than your content layer. There are templates. You have an admin UI that may be different from your editorial UI, which is different from your front end, and so on. But in reality, within monoliths, these things often become very conflated and discombobulated and overlapping. Because there aren't really strong architectural separations between the concerns, they inevitably end up bleeding into one another as deadlines loom and you have to make compromises in order to get a project finished. It's a bit like playing Twister. It starts out kind of nice and organized with all the dots in a row, but after the third or fourth spin of the wheel, everything's tangled together. And that creates a lot of frustration and friction within a project. And the decoupled architecture says, let's actually separate these concerns out with like real barriers or real gaps between them, usually some sort of API. REST APIs are very popular right now, I'm speaking in JSON, but you can do it in a number of different ways. And the benefits there are that when you really decouple the different aspects of the system, they can be worked on independently. You can choose the best of breed technology for each, and it allows you to iterate with teams in different ways. That's the big idea. And this is part of a kind of a broader trend or zeitgeist in the industry towards the notion of microservices. It's a pretty hot topic just in software in general right now. So there are many different ways that you can do a decoupled system. It doesn't necessarily have to mean just one way or another. You can actually do a hybrid decoupled system where the CMS directly still serves some pages, but then particular more dynamic aspects are delivered with a JavaScript app in the browser that speaks over an API. You can do the single page app. That's actually how a lot of Pantheon's own dashboard works. There's a single JavaScript application is loaded in the client, and then it just talks over an API to the back end. You can build websites that serve both people on the web and native apps in mobile phones and tablets. That could have direct CMS access for the web or a decoupled front end. You can have front ends that just generate static sites. And there are actually even cases where people will put sort of two CMSs in play, one to be the canonical content repository for editorial use, and the other just to control, display and layout and so forth. And the reason why, again, people are interested in separating these things out is that it allows you to leverage new technology and work with your teams in more effective ways. The front end is the fastest moving and most exciting part of the web technology space today. There's a ton of frameworks that are coming out. If you expand the notion of front end to include all the different clients that could potentially exist, you have mobile apps, you have tablet apps, you have the Internet of Things, which is a thing. So you could imagine your website actually speaking to cars and refrigerators and tracking devices and so forth. Also, from an organizational standpoint, decoupling allows us to unlock productivity within our teams because you can actually begin to iterate on multiple pieces of the system simultaneously. Frequently, when you're building in a monolithic style, you sort of have to build one layer at a time. And this allows us to remove friction from the process so that you can have, the people can kind of work on the piece that they think is best. There are a lot of advanced and amazing front-end developers who often feel like they're, working with one hand tied behind their back when they have to compromise for a CMS's templating engine or conventions. This also allows you to have more agility in your process. So for instance, if you build a decoupled architecture, you can swap out the front end or build alternative front ends at a relatively low cost compared to trying to retool within a monolith. And it allows you the ability to sort of future-proof what you're building. So you can, if you build a strong, back end with its like the right content architecture and the great editorial experience and so forth, you can keep that for years. You could plan on having that back end to be around for 5 or more years, while on the front end you can just keep up with whatever the latest trends in design and user experience are by kind of, essentially building new front ends against that API. And that's really kind of what drives, I think, a lot of the interest, because people want to deliver these really amazing experiences. They want to deliver really, really kick-ass websites, really, really good user experiences. And that requires staying up to the cutting edge. That's what customers increasingly, that's what they expect from the web. And the decoupled architecture allows you to really innovate at the pace that the rest of the web is without having to, again, engage in a large-scale retooling process. So that's probably all stuff that you guys already know. That's why you're here to join us on the webinar. And so I'm going to go ahead and turn it right over to Mike at Four Kitchens. He's going to take us through an actual case study where they use this technique to build an amazing website. Yeah, there you go.
Oops, sorry, wrong button. There we go. All right, thanks, Josh. Um,
1 second, Mike. There you go.
oh, there we go.
Mm-hmm.
All right, can we all see my screen now?
Yep.
All right, great. Thanks, Josh. So I'm Mike Minetsky from from Four Kitchens. Today we're going to go over how we are building twit.tv as a Drupal backend and Node.js frontend and content as a service architecture. So a quick overview of what we'll go over. First, we're going to get to know Four Kitchens and Twit. Then we'll dive into the business reasons that drove their decision to use this decoupled architecture. We'll dive into the details of how the site was built, followed up by a look at how this architecture changed our development workflow. So a little bit about Four Kitchens. We're a 24-person design and development shop. We build big websites, and big is defined in a number of ways. Sometimes it's the size of the audience, sometimes it's how much content needs to be migrated, and sometimes it's how big the ideas behind the project are. This time it's about a big new idea called content as a service. So that's enough about us. Let's find out more about Twit. So Twit TV with Leo Laporte features the #1 ranked technology podcast this week in tech, along with 20 other top-ranked online shows. They came to us with a Drupal 6 site whose redesign was delayed by an upgrade of their content management system. Together with them, we architected a platform that would keep them from needing to wait on a CMS upgrade for future redesigns of the site. Before we dive deeper into the business reasons of this architecture, let's take a quick look at their finished site. So here's the homepage in desktop and mobile view. Here's their show listings, again in desktop and mobile view. And here's Leo Laporte in one of the This Week in Tech episodes. So why did Twit want to pursue a decoupled or content as a service architecture? First of all, as I mentioned, they felt very stifled by the delays to redesigning their site that were caused by the complexity of upgrading to a new version of their CMS. Major version upgrades in Drupal require a full migration of content, as well as re-implementation of the theme or look and feel of the site. These tend to be costly and time-consuming projects, and they wanted to guarantee that future redesign projects would not be hampered or delayed by the CMS. Second of all, they have a very strong technology-focused user base who has, on their own, built a dozen Android and iOS apps using no other data source than the RSS feed on their site. They wanted to be able to provide a better experience for these developers and also build some Twit apps of their own. Being a technology publisher, they were excited about the opportunity to try a new architecture and be a part of the bleeding edge development. When we heard that we had built content as a service sites for other major technology brands like the Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon and the SNL 40 website and app, they jumped on the opportunity to push the envelope with a vendor who had experience building these types of sites. Since we decided early on that this project would have a separate front end and back end, we were able to use the best of breed tools for both of them. We took advantage of Node.js's lightweight asynchronous architecture to build a fast and simple front-end server. We used Drupal 7 for the back-end CMS and API server to take advantage of its excellent content modeling and editorial tools, all of which interface with the client's existing custom encoding server named Elroy, which was tasked with creating compressed versions of their production and video audio files. Once encoded, these assets were published to the CacheFly CDN, from which they were served to users. So I'm going to take you through a quick walkthrough of how these pieces fit together by looking at how a podcast is published and then subsequently viewed by a user on twit.tv. So let's say Leo finished recording a podcast. Their engineers input the metadata in Drupal. Drupal kicks off a job in their custom encoding server Elroy. When the files are finished encoding, Elroy publishes these static assets to CacheFly and notifies Drupal that the content is ready to be published. The podcast is now ready for viewing. To better illustrate how these various parts, how all the parts fit together, I wanted to dive a little bit into what happens when a user requests an episode, both when the cache is full and when the cache is empty. So on a warm or full cache, the request for the podcast comes into the Node.js server, which checks the Redis cache for the JSON representation of that podcast. If the data exists in the cache, it is returned to the front-end server, which applies the correct HTML and CSS before returning it to the user. Any linked media files are served directly from the CDN. As you can see, the content management system isn't involved in this request at all. On a cold cache, the request comes into the Node.js server, and not finding anything in the Redis cache, Node.js makes a request out to the Drupal backend. Drupal returns a JSON representation of the data, and then the Node.js server first saves that data into the Redis cache before sending it back out to the user, again themed with the HTML and CSS. Again, any static assets like audio files are served directly from the CacheFly CDN. So let's take a closer look at each part. On the back end, we use Drupal 7. Drupal 8 was evaluated, but the project timeline didn't line up with the Drupal release schedule. We heavily used the RESTful module, originally built by a Drupal shop named Gizra, but now heavily contributed to by us here at Four Kitchens and another shop named Lullabot. The module provides a solid foundation that allows developers to build web services based on REST best practices. As an added advantage, we found that we had to write very little custom code in Drupal, less than on typical client projects using a traditional architecture. Decoupling simplified the CMS code, and this really harks back to Josh's illustration of how the code can get a little muddled on normal Drupal builds. Based on our previous work, building decoupled sites, we had started to build a framework called Saucier. Named after the chef in a professional kitchen who makes the sauces that go on top of the food, it provides a framework for starting a front end that will connect to a Drupal content service. It currently uses the Express framework for routing, has a pluggable templating system that defaults to using Dust, and uses Redis for caching. In addition to bringing together the various tools, it provides a number of convenience methods useful when building these types of sites. You can find it at github.com/fourkitchens/saucier. The content as a service approach to building sites enabled some significant changes to our development workflow. API mockups allowed the front-end and back-end teams to start work early, which in turn really opened up the door for a better design in the browser workflow. API mockups free front-end teams from needing to wait for the back-end implementation to be complete before starting work. The mockup serves as a contract that both teams can count on and allow them to start their individual work streams as soon as the API design is complete. To facilitate this workflow, we use a service called Apiary, the platform for designing APIs and serving API documentation. In it, you edit your API documentation and API examples in simple Markdown files. And it turns that API blueprint into a documentation site that includes a console for making requests to the API through the web interface, and also provides a mock API server that returns API responses based on the blueprint. This is what allows the front-end team to start working from the API at the same time as the back-end team, instead of having to wait for them to implement the API server. One of the potential dangers of this workflow is the potential drift of the API server implementation from the original blueprint. API helps with this by providing a debugging proxy for your production API server, allowing you to make requests to the production API through API. It then compares the API response from the production API to the API blueprint and highlights any differences. When we started to build responsive sites a few years ago, we found ourselves gravitating towards the design in the browser workflow. Static comps no longer gave our clients an accurate picture of how the site would look and interact. We tried various approaches to this workflow in more traditional CMS architectures, but were always hampered by a clunky workflow and opinionated CMS front-end code. A decoupled architecture made it possible for our designers and front-end devs to work directly from the mock API server and design directly using the final framework that the site would be built in, saving time and headache. So a quick overview of our process and taking a look at some of the design assets. So we start out with very low fidelity wireframes. We use style tiles to communicate the essence of a visual language and nail down the colors, fonts, and elements of the design. And then we move directly to the browser using mock data from the API to design the final production templates. To recap, responsive loves design in the browser. The workflow in Drupal has always been a little clunky. Decoupling made the process much more seamless. So a few final thoughts. Decoupling empowered everyone. For the client, redesigns won't require a CMS upgrade. Front-end and back-end teams were empowered to have independent work streams that started earlier. And designers were empowered to design the way they have always wanted. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Appreciate you going through that first case study. I'm now going to turn it over to Brandon Bowersox-Johnson of Pixo to go through our second case study.
Absolutely. Thanks, Linda and Josh. It's great to be here. So I'm Brandon Bowersox-Johnson, the CTO at Pixo. Feel free to connect with us. Pixo is a tech consultancy, so we build full-stack web apps, mobile apps, enterprise websites, and we like to use the best front-end tools to do great work. So that's part of why we're decoupling CMSs. Our case study today is from the University of Illinois at Chicago, UIC, a redesign of their homepage that goes live in July. And UIC, as you might know, is an urban, public, major research university that's right in the heart of Chicago. UIC asked Pixo to totally rethink and relaunch this main web presence, uic.edu. And the site here that we built uses a decoupled WordPress architecture. So we'll talk about how we did that, why we did that, and show you how. So the old traditional CMS way of doing this, we would have built a CMS theme with the CMS's theming tools, but we really wanted in this project to choose the best front-end tools to make a great front-end and a great experience for visitors. In the old way, we would have had to have the CMS team and the front-end team and everybody be the same team with the same skills, but we really wanted for front-end development to be able to be a separate group of people with that strength and not have to be the same staff, the same team. Traditionally, we would have developed everything in the CMS's way, but we really wanted to start building the front end without any CMS there at all and without knowing what the CMS was. And finally, we wanted to avoid the costly upgrades of traditional Drupal and really get to simpler CMS upgrades. In essence, we wanted to fall in love with CMSs and CMS projects again. So here is our architecture. Traditionally, we would have a CMS and visitors would come to this monolithic CMS as Josh described, and the CMS would have to do everything, right? Provide the content editing tools, the templates, handle the visitors, but we really wanted to decouple and break this into more effective parts. We call it content as a service, but decoupled or headless is a popular name. And the CMS then gives its own URL, and site visitors come to the public site. The site fetches content from the CMS with a JSON API and, returns pages to visitors. At Pixo, we often use WordPress and Drupal as the CMS engine. For this particular project, we in the end selected WordPress. And the public site uses a templating system called Pattern Lab that I'll talk about and show you in a minute, as well as a tool called Outpost that we created to help build decoupled sites. So the development of the site for UIC really started with the front end in Pattern Lab, and we'll begin our tour there. Pattern Lab, as you might know, is an open source tool built all around a philosophy of atomic design. So instead of starting by making a full page, we make atoms and molecules that are the building blocks to make larger components and full pages. And you can test drive those elements and assemble them. You can find more at patternlab.io. So here is our Pattern Lab. It builds up from atomic elements and colors and fonts into larger components and ultimately pages. Here's a component called Highlight. We can test drive these components at different widths as they're being built, like simulate tablet or smartphone sizes to try out responsive layout. And ultimately, we combine these components into pages. So we're going to go look at a page template called the landing page. And every part of the page here is a different component. Our highlight component, we'll see in a second. We can test drive, put these components together, try this out at different widths. Everything that's in here is sample content, not fake Latin text, but realistic content that we plug into Pattern Lab to feed into the template before we have any CMS at all. So we can test drive our component, our highlight here, and really see how it works in the context of the site and the template. So next, I want to show you a bit of the code. So nerd warning here. I'm going to show code quickly. If you're not a coder, that's totally fine. This is the template for that highlight component. And it's a Twig template. In Twig format, you see the curly brackets. It's important at this stage for the front-end team to really chunk the content into the fields that will be later editable in the CMS. On the right, you can see a field called attribution that gets templated in. You'll also see on the top line that the quote highlight here extends from a generic highlight template. So here's that generic template, and here are the styles for that component. We chose to build our CSS using Stylus. Pattern Lab is totally agnostic, so we were free to choose the best. We also added Grunt to compile the CSS on the fly. And finally, here's a JSON file with sample content for the highlight. It includes a sample person there as the attribution field near the bottom. And this sample content is what got dropped into Pattern Lab so we could test drive. So here we are. We've built our highlight component. That attribution content is our sample JSON content. And in this tool, Pattern Lab, we've built a great front end. That's, the first step to a great website. So the benefits. By doing this, we've achieved some of those goals we talked about, right? We were able to pick and add the best front-end tools, Twig and Stylus and Grunt. Also, the front-end team got started right away. They didn't have to be CMS experts. And we could test drive the whole thing without any CMS at all. Basically, the philosophy is get started, build awesome web experiences for your visitors. Don't let the CMS hold you back. So at this point, we have a full working front end. And the next thing we're going to need is a CMS and some real content. So on this project, we chose the WordPress CMS. And our aim here was really to make the authoring experience first class and flexible. So for our decoupled WordPress, we used minimal custom code, similar to what Mike was saying. This makes future upgrades take less time, less effort, less cost, And that's especially important in Drupal, where minimizing the custom code and the add-on modules can really make upgrades less painful. We also used a component-based content structure around the same atomic components as Pattern Lab, and used the WordPress JSON REST API that eventually will be in WordPress core. So let's take a look. Here is our WordPress CMS. This probably looks familiar. Let's look at a landing page, and all the landing pages. Okay, here's the research page, the one that had our highlight on it. So at this point, we've actually built a page in the CMS, put in some real content. In the middle of the page, here's our highlight component. It has its fields, like here's that attribution field we saw earlier. And this highlight is one atomic piece that corresponds to the component we saw in Pattern Lab. We allow authors the flexibility to move these components all around and rearrange them, reorder them, add a new one in a spot where they want one. So we could go here and add maybe a generic highlight or maybe another quote highlight. And we can take them away if we don't want them. Basically, instead of rigid templates everywhere, we have flexible, reusable components. So, okay, now that we've updated that content in the CMS, let's take a look at how it's available in JSON format. So I'm using Postman as a quick way to show you the JSON. We can send a request and take a look at the research page content that comes back now in JSON. So it has some metadata here at the top, and lower on it has an array of content components. All those pieces that be rearranged and correspond to those atomic elements in Pattern Lab are now represented in this JSON. Let's see. Okay, here's components, and the image part of this is big, so I'm going to collapse it. You can see the second component here is our quote highlight, and I'll collapse this image too. There's that attribution with the content that we updated. So at this point, we have the WordPress JSON API feed ready with real content, a great environment where editors can make updates, and the front end can consume it. So now we've achieved more of our goals we were after here, right? We have a CMS that is easier to upgrade, simple, less customized. We have an unleashed authoring experience. It used to be that our authoring experience was all centered around pages, and it really lost track of the people who had to write the content, but this decoupled approach really helps us put quality attention on the authoring experience. And finally, we've made our content available as JSON. So at this point, we've built a great front end. Now the CMS really can shine as an awesome authoring tool. And the next thing we've got to do is connect all this to run the real website. So we created a toolkit called Outpost that we are making open source. And it's a framework for decoupled WordPress and Drupal. What is it? It's a lightweight PHP app. It feeds the JSON from WordPress or Drupal, like we've seen, feeds it into Pattern Lab templates and serves that up as live pages for visitors. There's more about it at getoutpost.org. The code isn't there yet, but if you go to that page and follow us, we'll be announcing more when it's ready, and excited to have contributors. And here's what Outpost needs to do, right? We have to handle visitor requests, which we do with the Symfony HTTP Foundation component. We have to fetch JSON content to go to WordPress and get the content. We use Guzzle. We cache responses with Stash, and it has some dev tools for logging and debugging. It also has what we call content objects. So when we get that JSON content back from the CMS, we use content objects to encapsulate it into PHP objects that we pass into the Pattern Lab template. So let's look at how. Here, remember, was the JSON from our page, and I've highlighted just that one component, our quote highlight, where we updated the content. And the code that's now around it is that content object. It's going to encapsulate it as this little object-oriented object that can be passed into a template. So this get attribution function is with an accessor method to really get the attribution data and hand it back. And it hands it back to the template that we saw earlier, where that attribution is going to get, passed into this field. So now let's take a look at the real research page with that content dropped in and totally served up by Outpost. Okay, so here we are. The research page is coming from Outpost now, combining content from WordPress with Pattern Lab templates and serving live visitors up, and here's the piece of content that we updated. So it's a success. We put it all together and it works. So that's all the pieces, right? The public visitors come to this Outpost-powered site, which gets the JSON content from the CMS, and Outpost feeds it through Pattern Lab templates to serve visitors. And again, we'll be open sourcing Outpost at getoutpost.org. So that's how we built a great site for the University of Illinois at Chicago. And in the end, we really did fall in love with CMSs and CMS projects. We also built a great front end where we could pick the best tools. The front end team was unleashed to be the best front end team and on a timeline not tied to the CMS. We gave content authors the freedom to have this great authoring experience and set ourselves up for easier upgrades over time when it's time to change out the CMS or time to change out the front end and the visual look. Those things are now independent. So back to what Josh and Mike both said, we've really set ourselves up in Decoupled for a better long-term architecture and a great site. So thanks. We're really excited to have some Q&A now and talk about these. Thanks, Josh and Linda, for having us.
Thanks, Brandon. Appreciate that case study. Now we're going to go to questions as well as discussions led by Josh. And there was one question that came in during the presentation around the cost of using a decoupled front end as opposed to like the normal way. So I was hoping maybe Josh could start with that one.
Yeah, I think that's a great jumping off point. And I feel like these were great case studies, and thanks guys for sharing the details of how you did the architecture and kind of where the wins were. I also feel like it's incumbent upon us to temper expectations a little bit, because it's not as though decoupling your architecture suddenly ushers you into a Shangri-La where all of the contemporary problems magically disappear. So I think that one of the things we could do that, on the subject of cost is to talk about, where we've seen, where you guys have seen these things, seen this architectural approach improve efficiency and help you deliver projects better, but also where you encountered, taking the fact that you moved your front end away from a CMS means that you had to take on more responsibility or do more custom development at that layer, as well as within the context of the broader microservices zeitgeist, if you will. There's already some backlash against that online because taken to an extreme, microservices leads to difficult to debug situations where, because you have so many moving parts and they're actually decoupled, you can't trace things easily through the system, and also more complexity in terms of ongoing operational maintenance because you have to monitor and maintain more services. So just wondering if the two of you could speak to both from a cost perspective or effort perspective, the upsides as well as the downsides.
And Brandon, maybe if you go first.
Yeah, thanks. So from our perspective here at Pixo, the cost factor, it really comes out a wash, but you end up with something better quality in the end. The front end time may take a little less even, depending on who your team is, right? If you traditionally just have Drupal themers on your team, then they might have to learn some new tools in this way. But if you have great front end staff who don't already know your CMS, this decoupled way means they can get started and build in the tools they already know and are the best. So in the end, I think the time is going to come out about the same, but in this decoupled architecture, you'll end up with a better product.
Great, thanks, Brandon. Mike, did you want to chime in on that one?
Yeah, sure. So I think that one of the first things to sort of remember is, in relation to costs, is that these are still software development projects, and so everything related to costs still relates to those. Managing feature scope and things like that still are, very, kind of important parts of the process. A place where one thing to notice is that we both built frameworks to be able to handle the complexities of these types of architectures. That development wasn't free, and that is one of the challenges right now. Is that there isn't a go-to, there isn't a lot of Stack Overflow questions answered about these, and there are multiple different approaches being built by different companies, and kind of using different API backends and with different architectural styles. So there's a lot of new ground being, and there aren't established patterns. On the upsides, you have access to a much bigger pool of developers on the front end. The other thing that is, I want to reemphasize is that the code on the Drupal side and on the CMS side ends up being simplified, and that is because there is less of the spaghetti that Josh was showing. So there are definitely advantages, and there are still disadvantages. Yeah.
Thanks, Mike. I actually kind of looking through some of the other questions that have come in. A couple questions came in about the authoring experience, particularly when it comes to WYSIWYG and content previewing. And I know that is one of the big challenges, or that's really one of the upsides, if you will, of the monolithic architecture, is if you have one piece of software handling everything, it's relatively straightforward for that software to give you a preview of what your content is going to look like. Can you guys talk a little bit about whether that was something you had to sacrifice or how you handled requests for those sorts of things?
Yeah, on the Pixo side, I'm going to pass it to Charles, who is our CMS lead on this project, and we have been working on the previewing feature, because with Decoupled, you don't get that for free. You do have to tie some things together to make sure content authors get good previews.
Mm-hmm. So this is Charles here. I've only been focused on enabling support for previews with WordPress at the moment, because that's what we're doing with this UIC project, and that has come a little later, and I've found a way to kind of interrupt the preview request in WordPress early in the bootstrapping process with the template redirect hook, so that we can, before any theme markup starts getting built and sent to the browser, we can stop that, pull out the preview content that is, it's like a auto save in the database, and then make a post request to file on Outpost that sends all of that content data to Outpost. Outpost can then package it all up to look like it would normally on the front end, send the markup back to WordPress, and then we just dump that to the screen. And that way we don't have to fiddle with OAuth and the WordPress JSON API and other complicating factors there.
Yeah, so I guess in summary, I think we'll see Outpost and other front-end tools for decoupled sites that support previewing functionality soon.
Mike, do you have a comment on previewing content?
Yeah, it's a very similar story with Dossier. On the Twit project, that was a story, a ticket from the very beginning of the project. It has yet to be prioritized, and the architecture is almost identical, where there's an endpoint to which you can post JSON and get back HTML fairly arbitrarily. So it's a fairly simple functionality, and it definitely is possible, but it like a lot of things in building these decoupled sites, there's no out-of-the-box solution.
It's interesting. Yeah, so it sounds like, there are ways to do this, and it's part of the framework development, but again, it's not something, it's one of the things that you used to maybe get sort of for free from the CMS that you now have to think about. A similar question that's come up from a couple folks is actually how to handle layout changes. So, a lot of CMS builds now, whether that's WordPress's plugins and layouts features, or Drupal's blocks or panels or so forth, they allow you to adjust layout in the CMS. And in fact, I don't know if either of the case studies that you guys are talking about used Pantheon in any way, shape, or form. We certainly wasn't a prerequisite for the webinar. But we have a lot of people building decoupled projects on our platform. And one of the most interesting ones is a very large website that's using the dual CMS approach. And it was specifically so that they could have an editorial experience from their, quote, front-end CMS, which does, has a very, very stripped down bare bones theme layer, but there's still a CMS on the front end just so that they can make layout changes without having to engage, so they can have a content editor or someone who's not necessarily going to write code adjust the layout of a page. Have you guys thought at all about being able to do layout adjustments as part of the decoupled architecture?
So here on the Pixo end, we saw in that case study, people can reorder things, drag and drop, which in this responsive day and age, putting things in order is about the best you can do, because putting things left and right doesn't matter anymore with all the devices. In general, we would, in a decoupled architecture, not use panels, not use views. We wouldn't use those modules that are making a bunch of layout decisions in the CMS. We would simply be crafting good semantic content in the CMS and letting the front end and the multiple front ends and consumers of content make decisions about layout. But things like the simple drag and drop ordering to kind of build page and modular pieces is something that's part of authoring the content. So for us, that's where that boundary is.
Mike, do you have a comment there?
Yeah, it's very similar to what Brandon said, but it's a little bit maybe a little bit more nuanced in that on Twit there's a very similar approach. Content can be reordered on pages, and also we're actually using the same module and the same mechanism for reordering the what they call site takeovers, which are similar to advertising units, where you would kind of, when you go to a site and you see that the movie that's coming out is the whole background, something like that. Brandon brings up a really good point that in a lot of responsive sites, really the most important thing, or the only thing that's really important, or the only thing that editors should have control over, is the order of the content, and not whether it goes left and right. That's something that should be defined in the website design layer, and that's a great way of enforcing it. So there's just an inherent advantage to only giving users that ability of kind of moving blocks up and down. That being said, there are lots of cases where something like panels is very important to the editorial user interface. So I'm actually poking around in, I wouldn't say working on yet, a way to be able to get that layout information out of panels in Drupal and into an endpoint of its own that then references the type of the content that's in those different blocks of content. And there's some inherent complexities to it, but then also the way that the rendering flow of panels works, there's actually some great places to sort of dig in and get that information out of it. So yeah, there you go.
Thanks. We have a couple of questions that are kind of asking for a little bit more, I think, tactile detail on exactly how you get the content out of the CMS to the front end, and I can sort of throw my explanation on that. This is part of one of the things that both Mike and Brandon talked about, was that there was less custom code than usual when doing these developments, but there's still definitely some custom code involved. I'm pretty sure that in the Pixo example, the WordPress was using the WordPress JSON API plugin, which is in development and is actually slated to go into WordPress core in the sometime in the next couple of releases. It's a big change for them, but they're very excited about that. And on the Drupal side, they were using the RESTful module. And these are essentially extensions that allow you, these CMSs, to expose their data as a REST API and return JSON response. And there's a lot more you can dig into if you're interested in that side. It's relatively straightforward to get something up and running that does a simple like to-do list type example or something that can show you exactly how that works. I don't know if either of you want to talk a little bit more in detail about the process you use to expose the CMS data over the API.
Yeah, I mean, here at the Pixo side, Charles was the CMS lead, and Matt Sharkey's here too, who was front-end lead, and so we can talk about both pieces, but Charles can talk about exposing that from WordPress.
Sure, the JSON REST API worked really well. I barely had to extend it, and that only had to do with getting out menus and basically a full sitemap of all the permalinks, as WordPress calls them, to all the different pieces of content. It was pretty straightforward, and fortunately the developers that working on this API are pledging some backwards compatibility so that when they go to version 2.x, which is what's going into WordPress core, they're thinking somewhere around version 4.5 WordPress, that they're going to release kind of a bridging release for those of us who have projects out there with the version 1x of the API. It'll just be a wrapper of API version 1x wrapped around the guts of the version 2, so that we won't have to rewrite any of our code that was made to work with version 1.
I can tell you from the front-end side that the WordPress APIs are really nice. We were even able to use gravity forms from a decoupled front-end, where we would request the form from WordPress, have the user fill it out, submit their values back to WordPress, where we would either get a confirmation or a list of validation errors. So we've pretty much everything that you could do on a tightly coupled WordPress site, we've been able to do in the decoupled environment.
Mike, do you have a comment from the Drupal end of the equation?
Yeah, so it's very similar experience. So one of the things that we really emphasized, because there would be app developers using this API, was that we wanted to be able to follow REST best practices and create an API that would be not just for sort of internal use, and so that you didn't have to know the internals of Drupal or of our implementation, and be able to understand it and build apps based simply on being able to visit the API and start understanding it. So we, using RESTful, we were able to build a fairly good and well-designed HAL REST API. HAL is a format that of JSON that adds a couple things that you would need for a RESTful API. The chief of which is the ability to have links and links between documents and links from a API homepage. So that's been a big part of the emphasis there. The other reasons that we really like the RESTful module is that it provides a very good programming interface for the developers when creating new endpoints and when formatting the data that comes out of Drupal. If anybody here is familiar with the Drupal services module, you'll remember that it basically just sort of vomits out the Drupal internal array structures, which, if you're not familiar with Drupal, are completely ineligible and ununderstandable and very, very difficult to get anything useful out of. And in actually a lot of cases also can leak potentially security dangerous stuff. So yeah, there you go.
Thanks. And both of you talked about pieces of your frameworks that you were going to be open sourcing. We've got a couple questions around that. Do you want to quickly return to what parts of your work you intend on making open source and where we can follow up on that? We'll put links in the blog post and certainly when we post with the video and everything, that'll go there. But just for people who are on the webinar now and really want to know, maybe Brandon first.
This is Matt from Pixo. We are working on, as we mentioned, have a front-end framework that we put together called Outpost. It basically stitches together a cache, a web client, a log. I mean, it's very light. We are putting it together now for release, and we hope that's going to be soon, maybe in the next week or so.
And the URL is getoutpost.org. There's a note there. You can follow us if you want us to ping you and stay tuned so that you know when it comes out.
Mike?
So on our side, the RESTful module is open source and is available. The Saucier, the Node.js front end, it is open source now. You can just find it at github.com/fourkitchens/Saucier. But unlike Pixo, we didn't really wait to release it, so it's still under heavy development. So feel free to jump in and see if it works for you. Create some tickets as to what problems you find. But it is not certainly not a 1.0 version of it.
Great. And the other, another question, variations of which have come in from 3 or 4 different people is, what about authenticated users? Have you guys thought at all about that in terms of what the experience is for people who are logged in? And is there anything like that in your current implementations? We'll start with Pixo again.
So in our use case for this site, all the visitors are anonymous and don't log in. The folks who author the content are a really well-curated team of awesome writers and editors, and they're going to the totally separate URL that is the CMS to do their authoring work. And so for us, that's part of why Decoupled made such good sense. But of course, if I think of other projects like digitallearn.org is a project we built that uses Drupal and organic groups, because every visitor is an authenticated visitor and is chatting and interacting and has their own personal account. And obviously in a case like that, this decoupled structure wouldn't work as well. And you really need the whole thing to be an interactive app that's constantly making database calls. So I think you have to consider what kind of site you're building as part of the equation of whether decoupling is going to make sense.
Mike?
Yeah, so similarly for us on Twit, there is no user, and on the current Twit site, there is no user login, no user-facing features or content consumer facing features. So that wasn't a problem here. The editors log into a completely separate URL and a completely separate application than what viewers are viewing when they're viewing content on the website. The one way to think about this problem and how to solve this problem is that your front end is in these architectures, and the ones that we looked at here, where there is a separate server serving the front end, that your content management system is a different application than the site that users are accessing. And really look at the architecture and think of the architecture that way. Now, there are definitely ways to be able to facilitate that type of login. And in one of the other questions, I actually linked to another project by Gizra that actually provides a framework for using Angular and Drupal and the RESTful module, and in that case, you are it is a front-end one-page app that is accessing Drupal as a data store for all the different interactions. So both architectures are possible, but it's helpful to think of it as 2 different applications, even if it does sort of collapse down onto one. Hopefully that makes sense, but it's too you no longer need to or should necessarily look at it as your front-end application and your content management application as being in one.
Yeah, and I'll also follow up. The 2 case studies we had here, both were, the flavor of them was the idea of the CMS as its own application whose users were editorial users, and then a separate application that was assembling the front-end end user experience that was, mostly a static generator. there are a lot of other architectures that do really rely heavily on logged in users. So, for instance, another example I gave before was that the Pantheon dashboard itself is a decoupled application. Obviously, everyone who uses that is logged in. When you're building, if you're building decoupled architecture to support native mobile apps, almost always those are authenticated or at least tracked users. We have customers on the platform who are major publishers who have a subscriber login system for like their iPad app, and that's actually back-ending to the same CMS that's powering their website. So there are certainly lots of use cases for the decoupled architecture in the context of logged in users. It just requires you to kind of consider how that'll be delivered. And then of course there are the questions of like forgotten password and so forth that can be vexing. We had a lot more questions, and we'll try to answer more of them maybe in a blog post that was a follow-up, but we are at time. So I want to thank Mike and Brandon for joining us, and thank you all for being on the webinar and for asking so many wonderful questions. And I have a feeling we'll be returning to this topic again soon. So we'll stay tuned and we'll let you know. Also, the video, of course, will be made available as soon as we have it transcoded, and we'll include links to Outpost and Saucier in the follow-up.
Thanks, all.
Josh and Mike, this has been great.
Yeah, thanks, Brandon and Josh. This was a blast. And then, Josh, before we close down, I wanted to make sure that we're able to preserve these questions because they've been really awesome. I really want to dig into them more. So just I'm hoping that there's a way to do that within.
Yes.
Okay, awesome.
Questions. Yep. So we'll be following up with you, Mike and Brandon, and then like Josh mentioned, probably have a blog post as well.
Okay, and a big thank you to all the attendees. These questions were awesome and love to continue this discussion.
Thank you. Thanks all.
Thanks.